He had been told to plan their funeral, but what he saw the new housekeeper doing in the dining room, her hands raised over a rainbow cake, her voice breaking the mansion's silence, made him drop to his knees and whisper, "God, is this you?" Charles Whitmore hadn't prayed in 3 years. Not when he lost his wife to the same immune disorder now ravaging his daughters. Not when the specialist stopped offering treatments and started offering timelines. Not when he stood in the hallway staring at the portraits of Elora, Elise, and Emma, once bright-eyed toddlers, now bald, fragile, fading. But the day Dr. Patel said, "Mr. Whitmore, their bodies are shutting down. I'm sorry. You may need to prepare." Something inside him shattered. Elora, Elise, Emma. 7 years old, dying. The rare immune disorder had stolen everything. Their hair, their energy, their laughter. Now, it was coming for their lives. Charles stood in the medical wing of his Connecticut estate, staring at 3 small bodies in hospital beds, tubes in their arms, machines beeping in sterile rhythm, their breathing so shallow you had to lean close just to know they were still alive. He'd spent millions, tried every treatment, consulted every specialist from Boston to Berlin. Nothing worked. Elise, the middle child, opened her eyes. "Daddy, am I going to die?" Charles's chest tightened. He knelt beside her, gripping her tiny hand. "No, baby. I promised your mama I'd protect you." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. He was losing them. The next morning, the mansion felt like a mausoleum. No one spoke above a whisper. The cook stopped preparing the girls' meals. The nurses moved like ghosts through the hallways. The portraits on the wall became monuments to what once was. Everyone had given up. Then she walked in. Grace Adebayo, 31. No medical degree. No credentials. Just a soft-spoken presence and something in her eyes that defied the weight of the house piece. Mrs. Calloway, the head housekeeper, looked her over with tired skepticism. "You're here for the housekeeping position, dear." "I'll be honest. Nurses don't last 2 days in this place. This house is waiting for death." Grace's voice was calm, steady. "Then maybe it needs someone who isn't." When Charles saw her, he barely looked up from the medical charts spread across his desk. "The girls' wing is off limits. They need quiet." Grace didn't move. "Mr. Whitmore." Her voice cut through the numbness. "Dying children don't need quiet. They need someone who still believes they're worth fighting for." Charles's head snapped up. Anger flashed in his eyes. "What did you just say? Your daughters don't need another person treating them like they're already gone. They need someone who sees them as alive." Silence. Charles stared at this stranger, this woman with no reason to care, no qualifications, no logic behind her boldness. But her eyes held something he hadn't seen in months. Hope. He exhaled sharply. "Do what you want. Just stay out of my way." Grace walked into the girls' room. 3 hospital beds, white walls, the smell of antiseptic and despair. She removed her gloves and touched Elora's face with her bare hand. Elora's eyes fluttered open. "Who are you?" "Someone who's staying." Elise stirred. "Are you a nurse?" "No, sweetheart. I'm just someone who believes tomorrow is coming." Emma, the smallest, whispered, "Everyone treats us like we're already dead." Grace knelt beside her, her voice soft but fierce. "I don't see death when I look at you. I see 3 girls who still have fight left, and I'm not giving up." That night, Grace opened the windows. "To let God's breath in," she said, and sang a hymn over them, a melody their mother used to hum. For the first time in months, the triplets slept without fear. Grace stood by the window, moonlight spilling over her face, and whispered into the darkness, "I couldn't save you, Amara, but I'll save them." And God, who sees every tear, every prayer, every broken vow made in the dark, was already moving. But what Charles didn't know was that in 3 days, everything would change. A storm would come, Emma would collapse, Grace would do the unthinkable, and a miracle would break through the silence of that mansion like lightning splitting the sky. Before we begin, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me where in the world you're watching from, because sometimes, when everything feels hopeless, That's when heaven sends help dressed as a housekeeper. But to understand how Grace Adebayo became the woman who would defy death itself, we have to go back. Back to the moment she lost everything. Back to the vow she made on her knees in a hospital hallway, clutching her daughter's blanket. Back to the day, she whispered, "God, if you ever give me another chance, I will not let another child slip away. Let me take you there." 5 years earlier, Grace had sat in a different hospital. Her daughter Amara, 4 years old, bright-eyed, full of questions, lay in a bed too big for her tiny frame, struggling to breathe. The same immune disorder, the same silent killer, but Grace had no millions, no specialists, no options, just a clipboard with bills she couldn't pay, and a doctor who wouldn't meet her eyes. Amara died on a Tuesday morning, holding Grace's hand, whispering, "Mommy, don't cry." Grace made a vow that day, a vow that carved itself into her soul like words etched in stone. If God ever placed another dying child in her path, she would fight with everything she had. She would not let another mother feel this emptiness. She would not let another child slip into the dark without a battle. That vow brought her to the Whitmore estate. And now, standing in the Triplets' room, Grace Adebayo was keeping her promise. The first morning, she did something no one expected. She opened the curtains. Sunlight flooded the sterile room. The nurses gasped. Mrs. Calloway protested. Charles started to object from the doorway. But Grace raised a hand. "Darkness breeds fear," she said softly. "Light breeds life." Then she began to sing. An old hymn her grandmother taught her. Her voice filled the room, warm, rich, unhurried. The machines still beeped. The tubes still hung from fragile arms. But something shifted in the atmosphere. Elora turned her head toward the sound. Grace moved to the kitchen and prepared something the staff hadn't seen in months. A pot of homemade soup, thick with vegetables, fragrant with herbs, simmering with intention. She brought 3 small bowls to the girls' room, sat beside each bed, and fed them herself. Slowly, gently, speaking life over every spoonful. "This will make you strong, Elise. Taste that, Emma? That's healing. Elora, your body is remembering how to fight." Charles watched from the hallway, arms crossed, skeptical. But he didn't stop her. 3 days later, Grace did something even more unusual. She walked into the girls' room carrying 3 matching pink dresses, soft cotton, delicate lace collars, bright as dawn. Mrs. Calloway frowned. "Miss Adebayo, those girls are too weak too." "Color is medicine for the spirit," Grace interrupted, her tone kind but firm. "They've been wearing hospital gowns for too long. They need to remember they're little girls, not patients." She dressed each of them carefully, braiding invisible strands where hair once grew, tying satin ribbons around their heads. When Charles walked past the room an hour later, he froze. His daughters were sitting up, not lying down, sitting. Elise was smiling. Emma was holding a stuffed bear. Elora was humming the hymn Grace had sung that morning. Charles felt something crack open in his chest. Hope. Terrifying, dangerous hope. The girls began to respond. Their appetites improved. Elise asked for seconds. Emma requested toast with jam. Elora sipped broth, without grimacing. Laughter returned, soft at first, hesitant, like birdsong after a long winter. Grace told them stories, silly jokes, anything to coax sound from their lips. The vitals began to stabilize. Dr. Patel arrived for his weekly assessment, reviewed the charts, checked the monitors, and stared at the numbers in disbelief. He pulled Charles aside, his voice low. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't understand this." "What do you mean?" "Their white blood cell counts are improving. Their oxygen levels are stabilizing. Their bodies are responding to something. But it's not the medication." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Something beyond science is happening in this house." Charles said nothing. He couldn't explain it either. But he'd begun to notice something else. Grace didn't just care for the girls. She carried a presence. When she entered a room, the air changed. Fear retreated. Peace advanced. She taught him small things. "Speak life over them, Mr. Whitmore. Not if they survive, but when they grow strong. Trade your fear for gratitude. Every breath they take is a gift. Say thank you. Pray again. Not because you're confident, but because you're desperate. God hears desperate prayers. Charles resisted at first. But late one night, standing alone in the girls' room, watching their chests rise and fall, he whispered his first prayer in years. God, if you're listening, I don't deserve this, but they do. Please. It wasn't eloquent, but it was honest, and something in him began to thaw. Then, 2 weeks after Grace arrived, she made an announcement that stopped Charles in his tracks. We're going to celebrate their birthday. Charles blinked. What? The triplets' birthday is in 3 weeks. We're going to celebrate. Grace, the doctor said. I know what the doctor said. Her voice was calm, unshaken. But I believe they're going to see that day. And I believe it will be beautiful. Charles stared at her. You can't possibly know that. No, she admitted. But I have faith. And faith doesn't wait for proof, Mr. Whitmore. It acts like the miracle is already here. That afternoon, Grace left the estate and returned hours later carrying bags. A rainbow cake, tiny decorations, balloons in pastel shades, streamers, candles. She'd paid for it all, with her own modest salary. Charles watched from the study as she transformed the dining room, hanging ribbons, arranging flowers, setting the table as if preparing for royalty. Mrs. Calloway whispered, Sir, is it wise to let her do this? If the girls don't make it to, let her, Charles said quietly. He didn't know why, but something told him Grace knew things he didn't. The night before the party, Charles found himself sitting at the girls' bedside, really looking at them for the first time in weeks. They looked different, brighter, present. Elise reached for his hand. Daddy, Grace says we're going to have cake. Charles's throat tightened. Yes, baby, we are. I haven't had cake in so long. I know. She smiled. A real smile, not a weak imitation. A smile full of life. And in that moment, Charles Whitmore, the man who'd built empires, commanded boardrooms, controlled billions, realized he was being taught how to be a father again by a housekeeper with nothing but faith. Joy was rising in the Whitmore mansion. The girls were laughing. The house felt alive. But outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. And none of them knew that in less than 48 hours, everything would be tested. Because miracles aren't given, they're fought for. And the battle was coming. The birthday party began at sunset. The dining room glowed with soft candlelight and pastel balloons. The rainbow cake sat in the center of the table, 7 candles flickering like tiny beacons of hope. Streamers hung from the chandelier, swaying gently in the breeze from the open windows. Elora, Elise, and Emma sat at the table in their matching pink dresses, ribbons tied around their heads, their faces bright with something that had been missing for so long. Wonder. Charles stood in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak. 6 weeks ago, he'd been planning their funerals. Now, they were singing. Grace led them in a birthday song, her voice rising above the others, strong and clear. The girls clapped their hands, laughing when Elise forgot the words and made up her own. Make a wish, Grace said, leaning close to them. The 3 girls looked at each other, then closed their eyes. Charles watched their small chests rise and fall. 3 breaths. 3 miracles. They leaned forward together and blew out the candles. The room erupted in applause from the small gathering of staff who'd been permitted to attend. Mrs. Calloway wiped her eyes. Even Dr. Patel, who'd stopped by to check vitals, stood with his hand over his heart. But Charles couldn't hold it anymore. He broke. Tears poured down his face. His shoulders shook. He covered his mouth with his hand, trying to contain the sob rising from somewhere deep inside him, but it came anyway. Grace moved beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. It's okay, she whispered. Let it out. I thought I'd lost them, he choked out. I thought, but you didn't. They're here. They're alive. Charles looked at his daughters, their faces glowing in the candlelight, and nodded. Grace stepped forward and raised her hands over the table. The room fell silent. Father God, she prayed aloud, her voice steady and sure. We thank you for this day, for these 3 beautiful lives you have preserved. We bless their future. We declare that they will grow strong, that they will run and play, that they will live full lives filled with joy and purpose. We thank you for hearing every prayer whispered in the dark. We thank you for this miracle. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen, the room echoed. The moment felt sacred, holy, as if heaven had descended into that dining room and wrapped itself around them all. For a few perfect minutes, everything was light. But then night fell. The first rumble of thunder came just as the girls finished their cake. It rolled across the sky like a warning, deep and ominous. Grace glanced toward the window. The curtains billowed inward. The wind had changed. Storm's coming in fast, Mrs. Calloway murmured. Within minutes, the sky turned black. Rain lashed against the windows. Lightning split the darkness, illuminating the mansion in stark, violent flashes. The power flickered. Once, twice, then the mansion went dark. The machines in the girls' room fell silent. The monitors went black. The steady beep of the heart rate monitors stopped. Panic rippled through the staff. Get the backup generator, Charles shouted, grabbing a flashlight. But before anyone could move, a sound cut through the chaos. A gasp, sharp, desperate. Emma. Grace spun toward her. The little girl's eyes were wide, her mouth open, her body rigid. Emma! Grace lunged forward, catching her as she slumped sideways in her chair. Emma, baby, look at me. But Emma's eyes rolled back. Her lips turned blue. Her chest stopped moving. No. Charles dropped to his knees beside them. No, 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 Emma, stay with me. Dr. Patel pushed through the darkness, his hands shaking as he checked for a pulse. Nothing. Her heart stopped. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Grace didn't hesitate. She laid Emma flat on the floor, tilted her head back, and began chest compressions. Hard, fast, relentless. Charles, get towels, blankets, anything, she commanded, her voice sharp and fierce. Mrs. Calloway, find candles now. Charles scrambled to obey, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the flashlight. Grace kept going. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. God, breathe into this child, she cried out, her voice breaking. You did not bring her this far to let her go now. Breathe, Emma, breathe. Thunder shook the house. Rain pounded the roof. Lightning illuminated Grace's face, tears streaming, jaw set. Every ounce of her strength poured into this moment. Come on, baby, come on. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. God, please. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. Charles fell to his knees, his hands clasped, his voice hoarse. Please, God, please. And then Emma gasped, a sharp, desperate inhale that filled the silence like a thunderclap. Her chest rose, her eyes flew open. She coughed, gasping, crying, alive. Emma! Charles grabbed her, pulling her into his arms, sobbing into her hair. Oh God! Thank you! Thank you! Grace collapsed backward onto the floor, her chest heaving, her hands trembling violently. Dr. Patel checked Emma's pulse, his face pale with shock. It's there. Strong. Steady. I don't understand. But Grace wasn't listening. She was staring at Emma, her lips moving in a whisper, tears pouring down her face. Stay with me, Amara, she breathed. Stay with me. Charles froze. Slowly, he turned toward Grace. Who is Amara? Grace's face crumpled. She covered her mouth, realizing what she'd said. Grace. Charles's voice was soft but insistent. Who is Amara? For a long moment, Grace said nothing. She just sat there on the floor, trembling, her hands still shaking from the adrenaline, her heart breaking open. Then, finally, she spoke. She was my daughter. The room went silent. She was 4 years old. Beautiful. bright, full of life. Grace's voice cracked. She had the same illness as your girls. The same disorder. Charles's chest tightened. I couldn't afford treatment, I begged. I sold everything I had. But it wasn't enough. Tears streamed down Grace's face. She died in my arms. In a hospital hallway. Alone. Because I couldn't save her. Grace looked up at Charles, her eyes filled with a grief so deep it seemed bottomless. I made a vow that day. I told God that if He ever put another dying child in my path, I would fight for them as if they were my own. I would not let another child slip away. I would not let another mother feel what I felt. She looked down at Emma, still breathing, still alive. Your daughters are the answer to my prayer, Mr. Whitmore, and I will not lose them. Charles stared at her, his throat tight, his heart shattered and rebuilt in the same moment. This woman, this housekeeper, with nothing but faith and a broken past, had saved his daughter's life. Not with money, not with credentials, with love forged in the furnace of her own loss. He reached out and took Grace's hand. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you. Outside, the storm still raged. But inside, something had shifted. A miracle had been born from grief, and the bond between them had become unbreakable. The weeks that followed the storm were unlike anything Charles Whitmore had ever experienced. Slowly, quietly, impossibly, his daughters began to heal. Not overnight. Not in some dramatic flash of divine intervention, but in the steady, undeniable way that dawn breaks after the longest night. Elora was the first to ask for seconds at breakfast. Elise was the first to laugh so hard she snorted, sending the whole table into giggles. Emma was the first to get out of bed without help, her legs shaky but determined. Grace watched it all with quiet tears and whispered prayers. The medical tests confirmed what everyone could already see. Dr. Patel arrived one crisp autumn morning, reviewed the latest labs, and sat down heavily in Charles's study. Their white blood cell counts are normal, he said, his voice almost reverent. Their immune systems are rebuilding. The disease markers are disappearing. Charles leaned forward. What does that mean? It means, Dr. Patel said slowly, choosing his words carefully, that their bodies are reversing the condition. Something that should be medically impossible is happening right here in this house. He looked up at Charles, his eyes filled with wonder and confusion. I've been a doctor for 30 years. I've seen remissions. I've seen rare recoveries. But this? The nurses began to whisper it in the hallways. The staff spoke of it in hushed, awed tones. Even Mrs. Calloway, who'd seen everything in her 40 years of service, would stand in doorways, watching the girls play and murmur, God is in this house. And he was. Charles felt it every morning when he woke without the crushing weight of dread on his chest. He felt it every time he heard his daughters' voices echoing through the halls. He felt it every time Grace sang her hymns in the kitchen, filling the mansion with melodies that sounded like heaven leaking through the walls. But the greatest miracle wasn't just the healing of his daughters. It was the healing of Charles himself. He became a different man. He stopped spending 18-hour days in his study, obsessing over medical charts and financial reports. He started spending mornings in the girls' room, reading them stories, helping them with puzzles, teaching them things their mother would have taught them. He learned their favorite colors again, their favorite foods, their dreams. He became present, loving, grounded. And for the first time since his wife died, Charles Whitmore prayed not out of desperation, but out of gratitude. Every night, he would kneel by his bed and thank God for another day, for 3 more laughs, for 3 more breaths. His faith, which had been buried beneath grief and anger, fully awakened, and Grace was there for all of it. She didn't stay as a housekeeper. The title had become meaningless. She stayed as something far more sacred. She became family. The girls called her Aunt Grace. Charles consulted her on everything. Mrs. Calloway deferred to her wisdom. Even Dr. Patel would ask her opinion before adjusting treatments, knowing somehow that she understood things science couldn't measure. Grace moved into one of the guest suites, not because Charles insisted, but because leaving felt unthinkable. She belonged there, In that house, with those girls. Healing had woven them all together. 6 months after the storm, on a bright spring morning, Charles approached Grace in the garden. "I want to do something," he said quietly. Grace looked up from the flowers she'd been tending. "What's that?" "I want to honor Amara." Grace's breath caught. Charles continued, his voice gentle. "Your daughter's love lives on in what you've done for my girls. I think she deserves to be remembered here. In this place, where life was restored." Tears filled Grace's eyes. "The girls and I talked about it," Charles said. "We'd like to plant a tree for Amara, so she's always part of this family." Grace pressed her hand to her mouth, unable to speak. That afternoon, the entire household gathered in the garden. Elora, Elise, and Emma stood beside a young magnolia tree, their faces solemn and beautiful. Their hair had begun to grow back, soft and golden, catching the sunlight. They wore their pink dresses, now symbols not of sickness, but of survival. Charles handed each girl a small shovel. Together, they dug the hole. Together, they lowered the tree into the earth. Together, they packed the soil around its roots. Grace stood beside them, tears streaming down her face. When the tree was planted, Charles placed his hand on Grace's shoulder. "Your love saved my children," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You poured everything you had into them. You fought when everyone else had given up. You believed when belief seemed foolish." He looked at the magnolia tree, its branches reaching toward the sky. "Let this tree be proof that God redeems every sorrow, that nothing you've lost was wasted, that Amara's life mattered, and that her memory will bloom here every spring for as long as this family stands." Grace broke. She wept into her hands, her shoulders shaking, her grief finally given a place to rest. The girls wrapped their arms around her, holding her tightly. "We love you, Aunt Grace," Elise whispered. "Thank you for saving us," Emma added. Elora simply kissed her cheek. And in that garden, surrounded by life restored and love made manifest, Grace Adebayo felt the weight she'd carried for 5 years finally lift. Her vow had been fulfilled. She had fought, she had believed, she had loved, and God had redeemed it all. Months later, on a warm summer afternoon, Charles stood on the terrace, watching his daughters run through the garden. Their hair had grown back fully, bouncing in golden waves as they chased each other through the flowers. Their laughter rang out like music, bright and unrestrained. Their pink dresses glowed in the sunlight, symbols of a miracle no one could deny. Grace stood beside him, a quiet smile on her face. "Look at them," Charles murmured. "I almost lost them." "But you didn't," Grace said softly. Charles turned to her, his eyes filled with gratitude and wonder. "Do you know what I think?" he asked. "What?" "I think sometimes God sends angels dressed as housekeepers." Grace laughed, the sound light and free. "I'm no angel, Mr. Whitmore." "Maybe not," Charles said, his voice warm. "But you're the closest thing to one I've ever known." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the girls play beneath the magnolia tree, its branches full and strong, its blossoms white and fragrant. Life had returned to the Whitmore estate. Not just breath and heartbeat, but joy, laughter, hope. And in the quiet spaces between the chaos, in the hymns sung over breakfast and the prayers whispered before bed, everyone in that house knew the truth. Miracles are real, healing is possible. And sometimes, when everything seems lost, God writes an ending more beautiful than anything we could have imagined. The triplets were no longer dying, they were living, and Grace Adebayo, the woman who had lost everything, had found a family worth every tear she'd ever cried. God had redeemed it all,